Good afternoon. I'm just going to have the video open for the first few moments of this video. Sorry, it was a little bit late starting. I got into the wrong classroom, I think, online. So it's 1:10 and I'm Sarah Griffiths, and this is EPE101, week 4. And I'm going to be presenting a couple of presentations today, and I'll have a break in the middle. It's just me in the class at the moment, and it is being recorded, so welcome when you join the session later on at your leisure, at your time, the time that suits you. So last week we looked at pedagogy, and we covered some links to the documentation of pracs that you'll be covering, and that are part of your assignment, of course. So everything links to your assignments. I try to link it in as much as possible. So today we're going over, I'm going to recap a little bit from the early years learning framework. They're going to look at the taxonomy of early childhood, which is how early childhood institutionally and contextually is organized, and that'll go into talking about quality areas, which is something you need to write about in your first assignment. And then the second part, after a short break, we'll look at the smaller components of observing children and what that means for our practice. So I'm going to turn the video off now and continue on in audio. So just turning that off. Right, so the intersection of the three critical curriculum components, some are for children's learning, some of which we've covered already, and we'll cover those areas in our first, in the 6 weeks before you go onto your prac. So we've looked at some curriculum content in the early years learning framework, and understandings, dispositions, knowledge, content, and skills that you will have read about if you've already accessed the early years learning framework and the educator's guide. Pedagogical principles and processes that we talked about last week. And if you have a look at the early years learning framework, I'm on page 38. It's represented really well here. Ethical and respectful towards children, child and adult balance, joint attention, prior learning considerations, responsiveness, holistic approaches, continuity from learning in the learning cycle, relationships with children, involvement, well-being, equity, intentional teaching, and rights, contribution, the right to contribute, the right to participate, the right to engage in language and engage in play. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll be looking at play in particular as an approach in early childhood. And when we talked about the cycle last week, when we looked at the early years learning framework, we also included the assessment, observation in learning experiences, questioning, feedback, assessment, peer assessment, and reflection. So in the second session today, we'll be looking a little bit more in terms of the observation and the assessment of what children already know, what they need to be moving into next, and how to assess their learning. So we'll start with the first presentation. Just check I've got everything. I've got the recording on, I've got my microphone on. Okay, let's roll. So there's nobody joining me at the moment, but hopefully you'll join the session later. So taxonomy is just really a word that means the organization of early childhood. And in this presentation, I might sometimes refer to mathematics and cognitive learning, but this presentation is actually for the practicum. So thinking and covering pedagogy, which is thinking about play, learning, and development as well. So pedagogy, as we looked at last week in the early years learning framework, is described as being early childhood educators' professional practice, especially those aspects that involve building and nurturing relationships, curriculum decision-making, teaching, and learning. So it's our whole approach, which has a number of components. So I'm going to introduce you to a form of taxonomy that will only maybe matter later on to you. It doesn't matter for this practicum, but I want you to read the chapter 2 that I've given you for this week's reading by Howell. And I need you to know what Bloom's taxonomy is, but you don't necessarily need to put it into action. It's been used across primary school historically, so it's been used in a very structured way. But some early childhood practitioners are now reintroducing the idea of taxonomy, but from an early childhood pedagogical perspective. But I'm only going to show you some slides of Bloom's taxonomy because it's what a lot of teachers in the field are aware of, and I wouldn't like you to not know what Bloom's taxonomy was when you go out there. So we're going to look at it from a theoretical approach, really, to introduce you to the idea, and then we're going to move into more practical taxonomies of early childhood that are going to be of use to you in your setting, in your practicum that you're going into. So I apologize that I have to give you some Blooms, but it'll mean something to you later on, maybe further down the line in further pracs. Right, so Bloom's original taxonomy, as more than a measurement tool, he believed it could serve a common language about learning goals and facilitate communication around persons, subject matter, and grades. So it's been historically used in the primary sector. Basis for determining a particular course or curriculum. So back in the days when syllabuses were more directive and the classrooms were more structured, so Bloom's was useful, and I have used it in terms of planning wider outlooks and overviews of planning. So means for determining the congruence of educational objectives, activities and assessment in the unit, course and curriculum. So you can actually see Bloom's as an influence in the cycle of planning that we looked at last week and that you can see in the early years learning framework. So it's still relevant, but not in its purest form. It's much more diverse now, and we need to consider more sociocultural perspectives in our use of any taxonomy. And that's what's changed. So the panorama of a range of educational possibilities against which the limited breadth and depth of a particular educational course or curriculum could be contrasted. Let's move on. So Howell in chapter 2, and I hope if you're doing the EPE101 unit, excuse me, Howell's chapter that you should have already read, hopefully you've got the textbook. Excuse me. Sorry, just had to have a drink of water. Taxonomy is a classification often used in hierarchical order of things or concepts that are useful to assist with planning and provide a structure upon which to develop lessons or learning sessions. So Howell's taking Bloom's taxonomy in quite a purist form there in her description. So it's like a roadmap for planning, but that's quite complex in terms of the early years. So where you classically see Bloom's taxonomy is in the structure of what we call unit plans, where it's a series of lessons and often integrated around a particular interest, or back in the day it used to be themes. So we used to have to structure our unit plans around this. So in terms of usefulness for you later on when you're doing unit plans, you may loosely use some of these categories or all of these sequential categories in arranging your unit plan in more complex planning later, probably in Prac 3. So the process: knowledge, recall and recognition of information, comprehension, understanding meaning, restating data, interpreting, extrapolating, and translating. So you can see how this would have been used more in a primary school context, and to some extent still is. So the application, use and applying knowledge, theory to practice, and real world scenarios. That's very important that we do that. If you listened last week to the general capabilities video that I put up, and we talked about it in class last week, you can see that the application of knowledge is a huge part of 21st century education, putting theory into practice and applying things to the real world in very complex ways. Analysis, interpret elements, organize principles, and analyze what's going on in terms of learning. Synthesis, developing the unique structure, developing the learning further, seeing where it goes, responding to changes you might have to make in your planning cycle, depending on what the children already know, what interests and what they've brought up. So it needs to be a more than two-way process rather than just the teacher process back in the early use of Bloom's taxonomy. It's more of a two-way process now where you're more learner-centered. So the early childhood practitioners are saying if you apply Bloom's, you apply it in play-based settings with the early years learning framework and in a more socio-cultural way. And children's agency and input it matters. And then evaluating, critically thinking through those processes, continually revisiting and reflecting those actions for those lessons. So that cycle. So you can see where Bloom's is influential in those cycles that we've seen in earlier documents. So first, our mentor teacher knows the children. They know their prior knowledge, the dynamics and the community setting. So that'll matter in terms of you learning the structure of your planning for beginning lessons or learning stories for individual children or small groups in your second assignment work. Secondly, your teacher can guide you, so you co-plan with your teacher. And if you follow the guidance and collaboration with the teacher, discuss the essential elements, feedback and advice on the process. And when you look at the Early Years Learning Framework Educator's Guide, there's some really good examples in the document of learning stories and all those headings and processes and thinking and thoughts that went through in ending up with that child's learning story. So that's very important for you to spend a bit of time having a look at parts of that document and the examples given in the latter part of that document. So you need to familiarize yourselves with those before you go on prac. And thirdly, you will learn too that the collaborative planning is something that's in common in all settings, and that team teaching and planning is a pedagogical strength. So you need to collaborate with your mentor and your colleagues to work with children. So in your assignment work, when you're planning, you need to make sure first that you need to show your planning, the rationale for your planning. And that is to say what and why you are planning and who for. You've already given me, you would have already done the first assignment when you start planning, which gives you some insight into the situational analysis, which is very important for informing your planning. And your explicit thinking in detail across your lesson needs to be there for your mentor, for me to see when you submit that. The second objective and the pedagogical approaches and how learning will be documented and articulated needs to be clear in your work. And when you look at those examples in the Early Years Learning Framework of children's learning stories, you can see all of that. You can identify those parts in there. And thirdly, a reflection on the progress of the lesson, how you evaluated it, and this will include feedback from your mentor. You might also submit that with that second assignment. Whoops. So hypothetically, not for now, but the Bloom's work will culminate into a better understanding of a unit plan in the school sector later on. But in this unit, my job is to introduce you to the idea of Bloom's. Now, early childhood author Arthur and other authors hopefully I've referenced it at the end of this presentation. Supporting a wider unit structure reflects on aspects of Bloom's taxonomy in their approach. So they actually talk about how to use Bloom's in the cycle of early childhood approaches to teaching and learning. So that's Arthur, Beach, Death, Dockett and Farmer, and it's the 6th edition, Programming and Planning in the Early Childhood Settings. That's actually in the library, so you should be able to get a chapter sent. I think there is one in the listing in the library. If you have a look under EPE101, there should be a chapter in there, but as an external student you should be able to get another chapter sent by the library staff if you want at any point. But it's a good book to look up. So they talk about negotiating the unit with the children and the mandated syllabus outcomes, or the early years learning framework in this case. So tuning into what the children know, what they want to find out, and their interests, investigating experiences and resources that enable learning, making sense of investigations, opportunities for children to make sense of their own investigations. So in the Vygotskian sense, you're continually interacting with the children at appropriate times and guiding their conversation and investigations and their explanations of what they're learning as you go. And then documenting what you know and what else we need to know. A lot of what you're introduced to in this first prac is documentation around the work of teachers. So investigating further how we can extend on what we know with the children. So planning into the future. And making conclusions, making generalizations, clarifying values, or assessing understandings is part of the cycle. Taking action, looking at what can be done, sharing discussions and reflections individually, small or large groups, sharing by discussions and their learnings. Evaluating the unit, resource, relevant pedagogy and assessment of the child's learnings. So if you remember last week, we looked at the diagram in the early years learning framework of that whole learning cycle. That's what this slide really describes, that whole process in the learning cycle, which is useful to go back to. And Arthur and others have just applied the Bloom's organizing in their approach to that learning cycle. So in that way, it makes sense to us now. But the purest Bloom's that's known about in primary education in earlier decades was more structured and rigid. But now we're looking at it in a more dynamic way and applying it to the work and the time that we live in now. And that's what these authors have done. And that's why that's useful to look in the Arthur and others textbook. Okay, slightly lost my way. Just a minute. I've got to, yeah. Right, so Bloom's taxonomy you will know about when you go on your prac. At some point somebody might refer to it and you'll know what they're talking about. So again, as a recap, the process, knowledge, recall of recognition of information as part of this cycle that we're talking about, comprehension and understanding of meaning, restating, interpreting, extrapolating and translating what we're seeing in that cycle, in the early childhood planning cycle. And just right down to your learning story and the small lessons that you'll be planning. You're learning those essential elements and processes that you'll be able to transfer and apply to later on when you're more involved in more planning in your further pracs. Application, using and applying the knowledge, theory to practice and real-world scenarios. The analysis, interpreting elements and organizing principles around the learnings, as we do in the early years learning framework, as I described earlier in the critical curriculum components in the children's learning cycle. Synthesis, developing unique structures, systems, models and approaches in our work that we do. You'll be exploring those things in your practicum. And evaluate, critically think through the above processes and actions of the lessons. So look back at that cycle of planning again that we looked at last week in the early years learning framework, and have a look at it in light of this taxonomy and the organizing of our work as educators. So in the article by Wong, Harrison, Press, Sumption, and Gibson and Woods, which I think is available in the library. Let me take a note just in case I didn't send it to you. Right. I think I'll have a look, and if it isn't in the library, somebody email me and I'll send it. It's not about Bloom's taxonomy. Well, it is about Bloom's taxonomy, but it's about their idea and theorizing around taxonomy in early childhood. The authors attempt to consider taxonomy in their research analysis of early childhood settings. So they discuss Bloom's ideas in terms of using taxonomy generally to classify the work of early childhood educators and the structure of education and care to provide a common language around talking about what we do. The weakness and interesting aspect of the study that I find is the weakness in the study's discussion is that their complete omission of the ASIQA quality areas, which has come from our national authority on how childcare is organised and how quality is organised around the 8 areas that we'll be looking at later in this presentation. So I find that very interesting because their categorizations are similar, but they have 10 in components, and they talk about the whole organization of routines, of staffing, of teaching and learning, of inclusion, a whole range of things, but they don't mention the ASIQA quality areas or compare them or discuss them in any way. But basically what they're doing is they're just discussing the organization of early childhood, the taxonomy of early childhood. So that's really what we're just trying to look at in this presentation. So we're moving away from Bloom's now to the taxonomy of early childhood by early childhood practitioners in the current context. However, it's useful to consider the 10 domains that Wong and others have considered, and this will help us reflect the structure and organization of our placement site. And this is useful because you are doing a situational analysis, and I think my sound just went up really high. Sorry about that. I must have touched something on my cord. Sorry about that. So Wong and others texts is only an additional text that covers these domains. It'll help you consider aspects of your situation that you are analyzing in that assignment 1. We will be looking at the quality area, some of the quality areas from ASIQA as well, but understanding the organizational structure of early childhood is helpful. So taxonomy generally is defined ways of classifying and organizing, which is what you'll be doing. You'll be analyzing how things are classified and organized and managed in your center that you're going into in your preschool. And taxonomy in the early years is centered around a range of domains. And these reflect the ASIQA quality standards and the way the quality is now organized officially and nationally and in policy and regulation around children's services, which are childcare centres, creches, family daycare, out of school hours care, all kinds of different services that we have. So looking at the ways that your placement setting is organised is part of your situational analysis and your assignment 1. So considering taxonomies, the way things are organised, it'll help you have more depth in your understanding of the organisation that you're going to be placed in. So early childhood is organised around both education and care, ECC. Look at the ASIQA website and familiarise yourself with the 7 quality areas applied in the settings of early childhood as our national authority, a governing authority of quality. You need to consider the quality areas and use them to inform your quality of teaching and learning. And we'll be looking at the first 4 in the assignment 1. They are structured in such a way that they underpin quality across education and care in any setting. So they're supposed to apply to any setting. So the quality areas are very detailed, and the following slides give you an idea about these. So hopefully you read the Wong and others, that article. It's not very long, it's easy to read, and it's quite interesting. So because those are early childhood experts and they're talking about these things. So I think that is relevant. And some of those authors also had some input into the ASEQA quality areas. So you need to also familiarize yourself with the EPE101 standards, teaching standards that govern your assessment in early childhood as pre-service teachers. Now, the EPE101 quality areas also, include all of those components of what quality looks like. So all of your practice and organization around the work that you do as teachers and graduate teachers will be to standard in terms of quality, in terms of the settings you work in, and quality of your professional practice. So they overlap, and the EPE101 standards really encapsulate the quality standards of the quality framework. So there's the ASEQA link there for you to go and have a look at. And it's quite a confusing website because it talks to parents, talks to professionals. It's a governing authority that even governs the university and our accreditation, early childhood accreditation of our courses. So it's a huge kind of big website, but you get used to familiarizing yourself with it and have a look at the quality areas that children's services are judged on. And that's what I want you to look at when you go. So the first one, I want you to write a paragraph about each of the first 4 quality areas. So you don't have to write about each of these dot points. You can just take some of them, or generally write about the educational program and practice. But just in this slide, we're going to have a quick look at the centre using the approved learning frameworks, of course, which you're going to be working from, that their approach will be child-centred because that comes under that framework of the programme, and the programme learning opportunities. So all aspects of the programme includes routines of education and care, and are organised in a way that maximises opportunities for each child's learning. So in that programme, there'll be a lot of details and critical areas. So we've got program, practice, and planning. Assessment and planning, sorry, which is back to that cycle. Intentional teaching approaches, responsive teaching and scaffolding, and children's directed learning. So there's lots of parts. And part of the assessment and planning is the cycle that we talked about, we've referred to, that you need to keep going back to. Critical reflection and information to families. So we document. You'll see in the preschool that they document what the children are doing, and they communicate that with the parents and with the children and with each other. So that's a little bit more of a look at that one quality area, which is education, program, and practice. So that's one you need to be writing about. Here we are again, another representation of assessment and planning cycles, which is essentially part of the same as the early years learning framework representation that we looked at last week. What do I know about this child's including? This is what you'll be thinking about in your planning. What's their current knowledge? What are their strengths and interests, skills and abilities, culture? What does this tell me about what and how the child is learning? And what do I need to record to make learning visible? We'll be looking at that in the next presentation after the break. What are my intentions for furthering learning and development? What strategies and experiences will I provide? So these are the things you need to make explicit in your learning stories and your lesson plans that you'll be completing for your assignment and your work in prac. How will I utilize the curriculum, including routines, interactions, indoor-outdoor environments, group projects and investigations for support to children's learning and well-being? Okay, and how effective, meaningful and relevant were these observations and analysis of those observations, responsiveness and intentional teaching, and planned programs? So again, this is something that reflects the cycle encapsulated in the early years learning framework that we looked at last week. So this is quality area 2. You're going to be writing a paragraph on this in your first assignment, situational analysis as well. You're going to be applying this and saying, what does children's health and safety look like in this environment? And you write reflectively about aspects, well-being and comfort, health practices and procedures. There's a whole lot of regulations from the health department about if we have an impetigo outbreak in the preschool, those children, the information will be given to parents. There's a whole procedure and protocol around it. The children need to stay away from school until they're completely healed, all those sorts of things. And healthy lifestyles, of course, eating, all of those things, sleeping, those cycles and routines are very important as part of keeping us healthy and our lifestyle healthy. And safety, of course, supervision. There'll be ratios you can record, incidents of emergency management if a child has an allergy. If you've got a child in the school with a peanut allergy, there'll be a whole lot of practices around that are critical to that child and other child's health and safety, and they need to be taken extremely seriously. And child protection management, of course, which we have mandatory processing in all parts of Australia, and there's a whole lot of protocol that goes around with that. Another part of that are the things like sun safety as well, and wearing hats, that sort of thing, drinking water, especially up here in the north of Australia where I am at the moment. Children need to drink more water. We live in a much hotter climate. In fact, across the rest of Australia, we've had a horrendously hot summer, and with climate crisis that's going to be increasing. So there's lots of health safety around those things. So you'll be writing about this third one, which is the physical environment. That the design of the childcare centre is in a certain way to make it fit for purpose, and it's well maintained in all aspects. It's clean, it's safe, the equipment is secured properly. There's a whole lot of protocol around setting up physical things outside that make sure that the children are safe. Things are tied with ropes and that sort of thing. You have to be very mindful of those kinds of things. And everything has to be suitable for every child to access. And an inclusive environment of outdoor and indoor. Resources support play-based learning, so resource materials and equipment allow for multiple uses, are sufficient in number, so children aren't in conflict over resources, and enable every child to engage in play-based learning. And environmentally responsible. The service cares for the environment, supports children to become environmentally responsible. That's a very large part of quality. It's in the early years learning framework. And you will observe how that's practiced in every day in the children's service that you'll be in, the preschool that you'll be working in as a pre-service teacher. So the last quality area that you'll be writing about in the assignment is the staffing arrangements around, there are police checks and cards, safety cards, ochre cards in the Northern Territory, blue cards in Queensland and in other jurisdictions are all in place before anyone can work with children. There are ratios linked to the regulations. Every effort is made for children to experience continuity of educators at the service. This is particularly important because children build rapport and relationships with carers, and if they're coming and going, that can be very difficult, especially for the younger age group with babies. It's very difficult if staff and carers are changing continually. That can be actually damaging for children in the very early years. Professional collaboration and professional standards comes into this as well. So you'll be commenting on these 4 aspects in this assignment, but you can also be looking at the quality 5, 6, and 7 as well. Relationships with children is a cornerstone of early childhood. Collaboration and partnerships with families and communities. You can observe and reflect on how that's done in your reflective work that you do. It's also, as I said earlier, these are part of the EPE101 teaching standards for beginning teachers and practicing teachers. So these are all parts of what you're going to be assessed on to some extent. So governance and leadership is another area that's important in early childhood. So service philosophy and purpose, management systems, roles and responsibilities are set out very carefully. Leadership, continuous improvement. So all centres now have either reached these standards or they're working towards these standards. And the leader in their service will be working very hard on maintaining and moving towards reaching these standards. So leadership, the educational leader is supported and leads the development and implementation of educational programs, assessment and planning. So in a childcare centre, for example, the director will be working with all of the educators, the room leaders, group leaders, and they'll all be co-planning and collaborating in terms of developing quality. So continuous improvement and development of professionalisation of the early childhood setting. And that's what the standards are for. They're for everyone who's involved in that setting. So the EPE101 graduate teaching standards applying to pre-service teachers, CEQA quality areas governing children's services that you will be involved in this practicum and others. The Early Years Learning Framework Educator's Guide, this scope and breadth of learning and teaching. And the Australian curriculum and how the key learning areas are managed and assessed are all part of this holistic area of early childhood. So although you will be in a preschool for this practicum, most of you still need to be having a look at the Australian curriculum and familiarising yourself with it in an academic sense, and you'll get to apply it later on in your other settings. 1 or 2 of you who've already had experience and qualified in children's services, you may be doing prac in a school-based setting where it overlaps with the Early Years Learning Framework. So, professional experience: observing, analysing, reflecting, collaborating and interacting, responding and reflecting again. So that's the cycle of us as professional practitioners, and that's what you'll be involved in your work, your documentation, in your practicum. So you've got some responsibilities. And you'll be supported and scaffolded by your mentor teacher. So chapter 3 is what I was referring to in the Arthur Deeth et al. Book that I mentioned earlier. Theoretical base for learning, child development, children's learning, children's play and play-based pedagogy. So those are the essential components that need to be considered. And chapter 3 in that book, I think we've got it up in the library. If we haven't, please let me know by email, not on Q&As, please, by email. But it comes from that programming and planning in early childhood text. The other thing that's going to be useful to you, which is included in the Early Years Learning Framework, is the dispositions by Margaret Carr. I'm not sure if that link still works, but you can look them up on the net. They're there to see. Carr's dispositions, you can see the chapter in the learning materials. I'll make a note of that as well, just in case So I've got to look up Wong, I've got to look up Arthur, and also the car reading, just to make sure they're there for you, and if they're not, I'll be sending them to you. So courage and taking an interest, a child being involved. If they're not withdrawn, they need to be involved and engaging in the environment, in the learning environment. So they need to have trust to be able to be involved. They need to feel safe. So building that rapport and relationships with children early in your practicum is a very important component. Perseverance, that children persisting with uncertainty and challenge, and be risk takers in their learning. Some children get frustrated if they're doing a puzzle and things aren't working out. So just giving them time and space, not rushing children to be able to finish things and have the time to engage in them. Which in schools is quite hard because things move very fast. Confidence too, expressing ideas and feelings, giving the children a chance to speak, engage with each other and with you in conversations around their learning. And that's why play-based is so powerful, because children can communicate with each other and interact, make choices, simulate things dramatically to be able to engage in make-believe around learning concepts. Responsibility for justice, taking responsibility for respecting each other in an environment, making sure that each other's doing the right thing, that nobody's prevented from learning, nobody's prevented from belonging. So all of these things relate into the early years learning framework. So you see the card dispositions are very useful. You can see them in more detail in that chapter. They come from New Zealand, as a lot of the influence of the early years learning framework comes from. And the Maori and New Zealand approaches to early years we have learned a lot from across the world. So think about how the CAR learning dispositions can be applied to the learning environment to enhance the learning. So that's something you should reflect on when you're thinking around your situational analysis, what's working and not working, or in your reflections as a pre-service teacher when you're covering your reflections. So play as an approach is mandated in the early years learning framework. Physical play, play with objects, symbolic play, pretend play, social dramatic play, and games and rules. So very important. So your situational analysis should include what the character of the environment, the physical and social environment, what ways you collaborate, your planning with the child, with the team, with the mentor or the community, who the children are especially must be very clear. I must get a picture when I'm reading that of where you are and who the children are, what community you're in, what the setting is. So the socio-cultural backgrounds, ages, languages, diversities. And then for the second assignment, you need to explicitly show that you've considered those things and and what are the learning needs, the diversity and inclusive needs of the children that you've observed. That needs to be explicit in your planning, and that needs to be included in your situational analysis. So how do the children learn best? What the learning styles are. Resources available in the physical environment, what resources, community knowledge that are being utilized in that setting. And if you were thinking about learning areas of mathematics or other learning areas, you need to identify the stream or the area of that subject. In this case, I'm using the example of mathematics. So you need to identify where that might, for example, in mathematics in the early years learning framework, you might look at the outcome 4, parts of the outcome 4. Children are confident learners in their environment. So you need to identify those things in the second assignment. But to enable you to start the planning cycle, you need to understand where you are and have done some of that situational analysis early on. That's what that assignment is about. Oops, so I'm going on about mathematics learning. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to give that as an example. So children's interests, what your observations are, which we'll be looking at in the second half. Emergent curriculum and learning stories. So have a look in the Early Years Learning Framework Educator's Guide. I think there are some good examples later on in the pages around page 72, 73, 74 and onwards. That give you examples of all the thinking and the headings that went through, that the educator thought through before they engaged in, or as they engaged in that cycle of planning for that particular child, including all the observations. So I'm giving mathematics as an example here, just to get you thinking, and how you apply your teaching strategies in that area. So it could be outcome 5 of the Early Years Learning Framework. It could be literacy that you're planning for in the second assignment. So you might be looking at communication, any area. So that's just to give you an example. So, okay, let's just move on to the next slide. I might have repeated this slide. No, I haven't. So how will you access and evaluate the area of learning that might be maths or literacy for your planning in that preschool curriculum, and how you negotiated the strategies you can use? So I'm repeating a little bit. So who are you and what are your beliefs about teaching and learning, your philosophy? You'll be developing that. And who you are does matter, because you bring a whole perspective on life to your work professionally, and that does matter. It matters to children. You're facing a diverse group of children, and children need to face diverse groups of educators as well. So that's very important. It affects how you interact in that environment as well. So what critical thinking, reflection, and inquiry will inform your decisions in your planning in the preschool? And I keep using this mathematical example. So you might be thinking about any other curriculum area. So that's for your second assignment when you're planning a specific thing. Okay, so some questions for reflection from the Arthur chapter 3. What do you see as the relationship between learning and development? You can consider that from that chapter. How does this affect your interactions with children? Think about your professional placement site and the analysis of that, and what opportunities do children have to learning through participation in that environment. So those are some questions to help you reflect after reading chapter 3. I've given you some sites to go to, and some of the chapters that I might have referred to in parts of this, in terms of what I was thinking about there. Okay, so we'll stop there. That was rather long, that PowerPoint. So we're going to have a 5-minute break now. I'll just stop the recording, so it should start again immediately when you come back to it. But I'm going to have a little break now and come back to the next component. And so I'll stop the recording for now.